a year ago, we started talking about cultural competency, and that led to other discussions about, it was almost like we were taking small steps with cultural competency, and how far were we going to go into this with the fact that the environmental movement has been predominantly white for a couple decades, or 3 or 4 or 5 decades, and has said that they were going to become more diverse. And if anybody should be diverse, it should be the environmentalists, because they know about the benefits of diversity as far as species with trees, et cetera. So when we started talking about this further, Leo and I started having a conversation, because Leo takes his bus and goes all around the state and works in disadvantaged communities, and the whole issue of cultural competency, racial justice, environmental justice had been brought up a lot of different times. And Leo has done a lot of different trainings with the volunteers that he puts on the bus and takes around the state every year. They go for 6 weeks at a time. You have like 10 to 15 volunteers. So he's gone through, as he said, 3 or 4 different trainers on this, and then they've come up with their own training. And that this is kind of directed at people who might come from a white privilege background and not be quite so aware of what's going on. We are getting more diverse slowly in the urban forest world. It's something that, to my mind, it's kind of like people talk about, you know, creativity or whatever it is. It takes many small steps. It's not a few big leaps. We're going to be taking a lot of small steps. So some of these discussions that we're having here are what I consider part of the small steps to change our perspective and change how we think and how we act. So with that being said, we've got this afternoon session on racial justice and urban forestry, and I'm going to turn it over to Leo. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Leo Buc. Like Cindy said, I'm the executive director of Common Vision. We're a nonprofit that plants and maintains fruit tree orchards in low-income schools throughout the state. So to date, we've been working in schools for 13 years, and we're in 254 schools from San Diego up to Sacramento. Before we get too far into what that entails, and before Cindy walks away, I want to thank her and congratulate her. Relief in the last year has really been stepping up and entering the conversation on racial justice in urban forestry and racial justice within the environmental movement, and that's really, really critical leadership to getting us to where we want to be. Can we clap for Cindy? You'll also notice I compulsively drink water while I present. It's the one thing me and Marco Rubio have in common. So, I want to start you off with a quote from the Summit on Environmental Justice in 1991. If there is to be a partnership made with the environmental movement, well, let me back up. The summit in 1991 was a gathering of environmental justice leaders from all over the country to establish the principles of environmental justice and the values of the movement. And one of the things that came out of it was a declaration, and part of that is this quote. If there is to be a partnership made with the environmental movement, it must be based on equity, mutual respect, and justice. The environmental justice movement of people of color rejects a partnership based on paternalism. I made an Odyssean contract with myself to start with this quote, to make sure that we would start with heavy material. And this is going to be a heavy workshop, right? We're talking about an environmental movement that has been historically, I don't say a historically white movement, I say a historically segregated movement. We're going to talk about that quite a bit. I keep forgetting that I have to use the clicker and not my computer to change the slide. The goals for this workshop are to lay the groundwork for an urban forestry coalition that is more reflective of California's population. So what do we mean by that? If this is the Urban Forestry Coalition, let's look around. Do we have the demography of California in the room? No. So that's one of our goals, right? We want the urban forestry community to have the demography of the state of California, roughly. Any movement, if it's going to be successful, needs to eventually reflect the demography of the populations it serves. We're missing huge portions of the Chicano Latino population, huge portions of the African American population, large portions of the Asian American population. We are missing people of color generally, right? In this room, certainly. Part of that is about fostering an actively anti-racist organization. And we're going to use this word a lot. We're going to use racism a lot during this training. We're not going to talk about cultural competency very much. We're not going to use the term diversity all that much. We're going to talk about all different types, all different levels of racism and how they intersect with the environmental movement and how they intersect with urban forestry specifically. When I say we're going to foster an actively anti-racist organizational culture within the Relief Network, we're talking about building the type of culture that makes sure that with our work, we're actually dismantling the inequitable results for people of color in the state of California. We're going to talk more about how that extends beyond just urban forestry. The DAC planting designation, while not based in race, is certainly going to do a lot, right, to aid, particularly around urban forestry, with dealing with those inequitable results. And then the third thing that we're looking to do is we're looking to prepare network members to work as allies in communities of color. One of the reasons we're doing this is that DAC designation for where funding is going. A big part of why these conversations are necessary is that as we look around at the room when it comes to who's working on urban forestry, and I do want to, before I say that it's predominantly white people, I do want to big up all the people of color who are working in urban forestry and make sure that we're not having like an invisibility syndrome where we're like, this is an all-white group. Hi. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for your work in this field. What we mean by as allies, and the reason why we're doing this is because, to a large extent, the historically white urban forestry movement, largely white urban forestry movement, is all of a sudden working in very different communities as a result of that DAC designation, right? When we have 100% of urban forestry funds going into disadvantaged communities, and let's be real, while color of skin is not one of the factors that they use to calculate disadvantaged communities, when you look at who is economically and environmentally disadvantaged in the state of California as a whole, you end up with large pockets of people of color in those DACs. And what we looked around and realized in the last years is that we are going to have these largely white organizations starting to work in communities of color. Right? When we look at that SB 35 funding, we have a lot of organizations that have worked in predominantly white areas, all of a sudden working or looking to work in areas of color. Because we're all nonprofits, and what do we do as nonprofits when the funding stream moves? We move with it. It's unfortunate, but it's something that happens, right? So we looked around and we said, ooh, all these predominantly white organizations that have been working in predominantly white neighborhoods are all of a sudden going to be working in communities of color. And we went, wait, I think Common Vision has something to offer on that. So I want to back you up and give you a little bit of our history. We started planting fruit trees in schools in 2003, right? Nope, 2004. We started our school fruit tree program. And our volunteer base and our staff and our leadership was literally, for our first 10 programs, 100% white, right? And we were looking to work in low-income schools. We learned a lot of lessons very, very quickly on what bridges need to be built and how to show up in a respectful way. Our organization, and I won't fool you, our organization made tremendous mistakes early on. We put our foot so far into our mouths, it is almost incomprehensible. So if you're coming from a place where you're like, oh, this is overwhelming, I've never dealt with this before, or like I've dealt with this and I have some tightness in my chest around it. I see a lot of you aren't breathing very, very frequently out there. It's all right, right? These things happen. It's not, when you have very little awareness on these issues, it's hard to hold you responsible for them. But the idea is to gain awareness, right? The idea is to gain awareness, and as we gain awareness on issues of race and power in society, it becomes incumbent upon us to start to deconstruct the systems that reinforce that power. So why is racism of unique concern in urban forestry? I just talked about it being incumbent once you gain a little bit of awareness upon you to start to deconstruct those systems. And this is true. And this first bullet point of responsibility, this is something that's not unique to urban forestry. This is something that everyone in this country has, particularly people who have benefited from the structure of racism, right, that confers benefits onto some people while disadvantaging others. All people who benefit from that have a moral responsibility to do what they can to deconstruct it, whether that be through the lens of housing, whether that be through the lens of urban forestry, no matter what we're talking about in terms of a responsibility around deconstructing those structures, we have it, right? That's not specific to urban forestry. But the SB 535 funding, like we said, all of the sudden, 100% of the state funding for urban forestry is in disadvantaged communities, right? We have a unique moment right now to build bridges and create a much more diverse urban forestry community. I would say that we have, you know, that we have a direct order to almost, right, via the DAC funding, right? We have no choice but to build a more diverse urban forestry movement right now. I think we all know that there's racial disparity in canopy access. Everyone has seen those studies? Show of hands. Outstanding. So there's a well-documented racial disparity in canopy access. And I think we all know the co-benefits, health benefits that go with canopy, right? So this is yet another way. Canopy access is yet another way that we sort of ensure disparate outcomes for people depending on their race, right? If you are born a person of color in this country, you are likely to have about 50% less canopy in the neighborhood that you live in. Right? That's just a statistical fact, right? So the fact that we get to do work, huh? 50, right, yeah, and those numbers may be high, right? You have much less canopy, and we know the health outcomes that go with that. So we have a fantastic opportunity in the next bunch of years to start to undo that, right? And to start to create canopy in the disadvantaged communities, in communities of color. And finally, I guess I probably have a few more things in common with Hillary Clinton, but stronger together, right? This is the idea that if we build a more diverse movement, we're going to have a stronger movement that can move ahead, right? And can start to do greater stuff, not just when we're talking about disrupting racism, not just when we're talking about creating a more equitable canopy. We can create a better canopy everywhere, the more people and the more diverse people we pull into this movement. So we're going to go ahead and break up into some small groups right off the bat. We're going to try to keep this interactive. I work with kids a lot, and normally I would count you all off and break you up into small groups, but I think I trust you all to self-organize. So if we can break up into groups of, let's say, 5 people, and I want everyone to we're going to take 5 minutes once you're in groups and come up with a group definition for what racism is. In total, not specific to urban forestry. Thank you. minutes. It's a 2-minute warning. All right, we're going to take 30 more seconds, so finalize it, and then we're going to be coming back. All right, we all ready to come back to the front here? We can pass the microphone? Yeah, either way works. Perfect. All right, so we've got a microphone out in the audience now. So let's go ahead and wrap it up. We are going to share some of the definitions that came out of the group part and have a little conversation about them. I'm going to start calling people out by name like you did, Cindy. So walking around, it sounded like there were some good conversations going on in the groups. I want to take a moment to let a few of the groups share what you came up with as definitions. We've got a microphone, I think, over here with, you all are going to be group 1 because you have a microphone.
Hello. I was handed this. So we had a lengthy conversation, but I think in sum, our definition would be racism is using power to desegregate and push a person or persons of a specific race into disadvantages. Disadvantages? That's the word, right? Disadvantages. Disadvantage.
We also had a good conversation about it, but I think we came to the definition, Uriel with Canopy, that racism is privileges being given and taken to people of a certain race, and the propagation of certain power relationships based on prejudice. The current struggle being manifested, in that we're sort of going from a sense of we're better than you, we're going to keep you down, to we're better than you, we're going to bring you up, and we're the only ones that can do that. So.
Well, we kind of went on the shorter end of definitions and kind of just went with differential treatment based on a difference that you see, and it's because of race. We talked about some different things, systematic approaches to it, right, or differences that way. We talked about kind of inferiority, kind of complex type thing, and or superiority, I guess. And what was something else that we talked about? What was another one? Oh, intentional. There we go. Intentional. And there was one other thing. I think that was mostly it. But we should have came up with one sentence for it. Huh? It's solid. Okay, it's good. All right.
Okay, I was a scribe because I said I'd been having conversations with Leo, so I didn't want to cheat. And we tried to meld them all together into institutional, large-scale, limiting of opportunities and expectations based on color or culture.
Cool, and let's get one more group to share, and then we'll jump into some more.
Our group was really excited about our definition. We had a lot of great conversation. We came up with the cultural, political, and economic institutionalized oppression of individuals and groups driven by socially constructed notions of race, which is a very long sentence.
I want to stand up on that one. Yeah. So I do this exercise in every training, every anti-racism training that we do. We do this exercise every single time, whether it's for our volunteers, whether it's for a network association, no matter who we're doing it with kids, right? No matter who we're doing it with, we do this "what is racism" question. And this answer, fortunately, has been coming up less and less often. Although for a long time, this was the answer that people came up with. Well, some people came up with. This idea that racism equals race prejudice, right? This idea that treating someone differently, this sort of simplistic racism that we were taught about in the 3rd grade, right? That treating somebody differently dependent on their color of their skin was racism. There's one more component, right? There's a power component. Because race prejudice without the power to impact somebody's life is virtually meaningless, right? So we always talk about this power component when we talk about an ism, right? Whether it's by people, social groups, or institutions, having the power to actually have your prejudice result in disparate impact, right? Disparate outcomes for people is what brings something to the level of an ism. As an aside, typically I would do this with a video with a comic who does it much better than I do. But I do want to take a moment to sort of demonstrate how this disproves one thing that people bring up a lot of the time, and that is reverse racism, right? This idea that white people being discriminated against is a form of racism. And unfortunately, there's no Wi-Fi in here, so no YouTube, so no Amer Rahman. But without this power component, like, people of color can be discriminatory towards white people. White people can be discriminatory towards white people. But without that institutional level impact on what the outcomes of your life are, right? Without the impact on what opportunities are available to you, what your likely health outcomes are, what your educational outcomes are, what your criminal justice outcomes are, so on and so forth, it doesn't rise to the level of an ism, right? You may or may not agree with that, but know that for the rest of this conversation today, anytime I refer to racism, it's going to be racism against people of color, right? Backed by institutions, backed by a legacy and a history in this country that results in disparate outcomes in almost every measurable quality of life thing. So I want to speak to a couple of things before we bump ahead too far in slides. Oh, Amer Rahman, you're so good. Before we bump ahead too far in slides, I want to speak to a couple of things I heard in the definitions. One of them that we generally teach in these workshops that I said I wasn't going to teach today, but I'm coming back around on, I heard the word intent in there, right? And there's a concept that we really like to teach in these workshops, and this is a little bit more of a personal concept about measuring intent and measuring impact. And the way we're going to measure when it comes to whether something is racist or whether it is racialized, right? We're going to measure impact. Intent, I know the Supreme Court says that Title VI says that you have to prove intent for an environmental justice issue. I disagree with the Supreme Court on that. We're going to measure with impact, right? If a policy that we have or an action that we take as an individual, right, impacts someone in a way that hurts them because of their race, whether we're talking about opportunity to canopy, whether we're talking about education, whether we're talking about a conversation with a friend, right? If the impact is racist, that's where we're going to measure it. All too often, we look at the intent and very, very often excuse ourselves by the intent, right? People say, oh, I didn't mean it like that, right? But what's being questioned isn't necessarily how one means it. It's the impact of it. And if you're not willing to investigate that impact, if you're not willing to understand that impact, then your intention isn't worth anything to begin with. Everyone follow that? Right? If you're not willing to measure it against the impact and listen with open ears about what that impact is, or learn with open ears about what that impact is, then your intention wasn't worth its salt to begin with. So we're going to talk about 4 types of racism. And again, a lot of this is about building a common language, right? If we're going to move ahead as a movement, we need to have a common language to discuss these issues. The first of them is individual racism, right? And this is the type of racism that we did learn about in 3rd grade. This is individual acts of meanness. And I want to relate each one of these to the environmental movement specifically, right? And to how we may see it in our professional lives, as everyone in here identifies as an environmentalist, I'm assuming? Yeah? Ah, good. Yeah, anybody not identify as an environmentalist? Good. So this individual racism, this is the type of, right, you don't identify, well, I'm putting it on you. It's an assigned identity today. You're all environmentalists. Individual racism is the type of racism we learned about in 3rd grade, right? It's individual acts of meanness. It's name-calling, right? It's judging a person individually based on that. Where we may see it in the environmental movement is inter-office politics, right? Working across cultural boundaries, across racial boundaries, within our own organizations, or with students you work with. Who here is familiar with the term microaggression? We're not going to go too deep into microaggressions. In fact, we're not going to go deep at all. If you're not familiar with it, because this is not supposed to be a personal training, look up microaggressions. That's a really, really good place to get some basic starters going.
Microaggressions
Microaggressions.org, yep, that's a fantastic resource. These are individual interactions, right, that contribute to, especially I think in the environmental movement, contribute to people of color not feeling as comfortable in the whiter areas of the environmental movement. Everyone clear on individual racism, individual acts of meanness, assumption making, so on and so forth, microaggressions, tokenizing. When we talk about social racism, that's in groups of people, obviously, right? One of the main things that we see happen in social racism within the environmental movement, and really within progressive movements in general, not progressive movements, liberal movements in general, is what voices carry power in a room, right? Very, very often, people have what's called, unconscious biases, right? Where they're not taking the words of people of color in a meeting, in a social group, with nearly as much weight as they may take the white male voice. Hi. Coincidentally, that's why it's really important that the white male voice speaks into issues of institutional power, right? One of the things we came out of from last year's conference was, wow, wouldn't it be great if a white man who carries a disproportionate amount of social power spoke into racial justice issues at our next conference? Hi. So the next level of racism that we're going to talk about is institutional racism. And when we talk about institutional racism, we're talking about racism by large institutions, right? We're talking about the police department, the judicial system, the educational system, so on and so forth. Where we see this in the case of environmentalism, things become a little bit more clear, right? We see lax enforcement on environmental regulations in communities of color. Right? We see highly pollutant industries predominantly located in communities of color, so on and so forth. And then we have systemic racism, which is the cumulative impact of all of these different types, right? And I want to take a moment just to make sure we're all on the same page about sort of how large of a structure we're talking about. We're talking about a structure that impacts virtually, every sort of sector that you can look across, every quality of life measurement that you can look across. So these are just a few examples, and there's actually, at the end of this slideshow, and you can access the slideshow, I'm guessing, later through Relief's network. There's like 40 or 50 more examples of ways in which your outcome, if you're a person of color in this country, is likely very different than that if you're a white person. Let's go ahead and get a few more voices out there. Since this is a 2-hourer, Rachel, you're right next to a microphone. Will you grab it and either talk into it or hand it to someone? If someone would read the first of these bullet points and then pass the microphone.
Wealth. People of color are 2.5 times more likely to be rejected for a loan with identical income.
So just to make sure everyone understands what we're talking about there, that is, if you have the same job, make the same amount of money, and have the same amount of money in the bank, a person of color is 2.5 times more likely to get rejected for the same loan as a white person.
Criminal justice, black men receive prison sentences that are 20% more? Is it missing a word there?
Yeah, we are missing a word. Thank you.
More than their white peers for the same crime.
That one I feel like needs no explanation.
Employment. Black men with clean records get callbacks for job interviews at similar rates to white men with felony records. Black-sounding names result in roughly 1/3 the interview opportunities with identical resumes.
And that number is actually more like half. That's actually 2 points. When we talk about that first one, again, a black man with a clean record would get callbacks from interviews at about the same rate as if I had a felony. That's astounding. Like, when you think about what a big deal a felony is when it comes to employment opportunity, it is astounding. I do this not to bum you out, right? I'm not bringing all these statistics for you to be like, whoa, that's upsetting. And I think a lot of you are aware of this, right? Are folks aware of the sort of scale of problem that we're talking about? I bring it just in case people think that maybe this is a problem that's not as big as it was 20 years ago. When it comes to most of these metrics, they haven't gotten better in the last 20 years. Education opportunity for people of color in the last 30 years has gotten worse, right? As busing programs have been shut down, as districts have gone, well, that didn't work, the education disparity has gotten worse in the last 30 years, not better, right? Because as we go ahead and we try to apply these colorblind policies as a society, right? When you apply a colorblind policy over an inequitable field, you wind up with, guess what? More inequity. It gets worse, right? This black-sounding name study, these were literally identical resumes. You know, a resume got sent out with, you know, John Smith and Aisha Smith, right, as the two names on it, and the callbacks were actually nearly double for the generic names versus the black-sounding names. Someone want to read the education one?
Education. Schools serving people of color are underfunded at a rate of double that of their white peers. For every 10% of the student base that are people of color, school funding drops nearly $100 per student.
That's a tremendous amount of money, $100 per student for every 10% that the student base is comprised of students of color. Everyone know about how school funds are distributed in this country? I'll tell you in case you don't. So school funds are determined by property value in the district that they serve. School funds are determined by property value in the district that they serve because they're a derivative of property tax, right? Well, let's think about a few of the ways that that's problematic. Who here's familiar with the historical practice of redlining? All right, so we got some. This is a big one. I'm not going to go too deep. You should Google this if you're not familiar with it. But as part of the GI Bill at the end of World War II, the U.S. government 100% guaranteed loans for soldiers returning to the war to buy a house. Now, you may or may not know this, but for 80% roughly of middle-income Americans who have intergenerational wealth, that's something to leave their kids, the house that they own represents more than 90% of that wealth. So for huge swaths of the country, home ownership is the entirety of intergenerational wealth. Now, when this GI Bill happened, the government said we will 100% back loans given to soldiers from World War II on houses, unless they're in certain neighborhoods where the loans are too risky. You may look at that from 2016 and go, well, that's no problem. You just buy a house in a different neighborhood. If you have a 100% backed loan, then someone's going to sell you a house. Except it was still the 1940s, and there were housing covenants in place. Right? So if you looked at Los Angeles, for example, there were very, very limited neighborhoods where a person of color could actually buy a house at that time. And surprise, surprise, guess what neighborhoods were all within the red lines on the maps where they would not guarantee loans? Communities of color. As a side note, we see that impact today in urban forestry. That history of redlining impacts our ability to develop canopy in communities of color. How many of you have had issues due to home ownership where you can't get that signature that you need for the relief grant from the property owner, right? That's something that we run into, is you need permission from a property owner to be compliant with some of the grants. So that history of redlining still impacts our ability to do urban forestry today, right? Because the people in the community don't own the houses. Yeah, because of that history of redlining, because there hasn't been an opportunity with a 100% backed U.S. government loan where if it defaults, the government pays the bank. Yeah, it was just a tremendous, tremendous boon to white soldiers coming back from that war that people of color were completely left out of due to housing covenants and that practice of redlining. So housing covenants, there were neighborhood associations in places where there wasn't necessarily legal housing segregation in place, although I would argue that there may still be legal housing segregation in place some places. There were agreements between neighborhood associations that they would absolutely not sell their homes to people of color, should they choose to move. And often these were legally enforceable contracts. So I talk about this this degree of systemic racism mainly because mainly to counteract this cultural narrative that we have around bootstrapping, right? We have this ridiculous cultural narrative in America that everything we've earned, through our own hard work. And I'm talking to you here, white people. Everything we've earned through our own hard work, right? And this is just an utter fallacy. It is not true at all. And the idea that, other people need to bootstrap their way, need to pull themselves out of poverty, lift themselves out of poverty, so on and so forth. It's just not the case. It's not. There's a stacked deck, right? And all of these different sort of systemic level tools have stacked that deck. So rather than approaching, we often approach our work in communities from either a charitable idea or like this "we're giving something to you" idea, or quite the opposite of like, we're just going to leave tools. We're going to have this real short-run program that just leaves tools behind so that people can manage their own fate. What about another idea? What about one where we actually continually work together? It's kind of a different framework, right? Continued working together between the communities that we're serving and the organizations that are serving them. And it's one I favor strongly. Questions on systemic racism? Outstanding. We'll explore it a little bit more later in the presentation. So I said this at the beginning, that the environmental movement is not a white movement, right? It's a largely segregated movement. We see this very, very frequently, right? We partner, Common Vision partners very, very often with organizations that are run by, volunteered with, staffed by people of color, right? It's not that these organizations aren't out there. It's not that black and brown people are not involved in the environmental movement. It's that the two wings of the environmental movement have largely stayed separate. Very often, you hear it said, right, the environmental movement is a white movement, right? You hear it said very often by white people that it's a white movement. How dominant is the discussion of environmental justice right now in the environmental movement? Yeah, it's ubiquitous, right? The concept of environmental justice is ubiquitous. You know who came up with the concept of environmental justice? Not white people. People of color. The thing that is right now like core, part and parcel of the environmental movement, the thing that we talk about the most in the environmental movement is an idea that grew out of communities of color. It's hard to argue that that's a white movement. You see what I'm getting at there? It's hard to argue when the core concept that we're working with right now emanated from, literally a conference attended by people of color within the environmental movement. Climate equity. All right, climate equity, one of the hot topics in the environmental movement right now, also grew out of discussions in communities of color. So the idea that we would say that it is a white movement is in and of itself co-opting, right? When core concepts from the environmental movement came out of communities of color. There's often a belief that communities of color are not invested in the environment or are not interested in environmental issues. Countless studies have turned up exactly the opposite. There's studies out of Yale, and let's see, there's another study out of George Mason, both of which have turned up higher rates of belief, and belief goes in quotation marks because you don't have to believe in climate change for it to be real, and support for action on climate change. There are higher rates in communities of color than there are in the white population in this country. 60.3% of Hispanics believe that humans contribute to climate change, 67% of African Americans, 69% of Asian Americans, and a whopping 55% of Americans who identify as white believe in climate change, think it's anthropogenic, and think we need to take action on it. Doesn't sound like environmentalism is a white movement to me. From the Yale study, 89% of African Americans support regulation of carbon dioxide as a pollutant, when compared with just over 70% of white people. So there's tremendous support in communities of color for environmental regulation, tremendous support. Another one of these studies turned up much higher levels of concern with the environment immediately surrounding one's home in communities of color. So this idea, in addition to sort of the advocacy and the thought leadership, right? People think the thought leadership in the environmental movement has been largely by white people. I contend that's not the case with environmental justice and climate equity, two of our hottest topics. And this idea that white people are more interested in the environment, more invested in the environment. They just don't statistically bear out, right? Communities of color are every bit as invested and every bit as interested. So it's time for another group exercise. I get to drink another thing of water. Let's break up into different groups than we were in before, groups of 5 again. I want you to write out a timeline of the environmental movement. Know your history. Okay, so we're going to wrap up and come back and share in 1 minute.
I've turned it on, but I'm going to start it back here. I thought this was a good table to start with. All right, this thing is live, Tony, okay?
I hope. We want to talk trash, right? I hope our indiscriminate ramblings are enough for you to. Hey, remember that thing?
So when are you gonna? when are you gonna start? I feel like this is a trick question. Yeah. We're being set up to show our white.
We'll be like, oh yeah, you're all wrong.
I'm ready for it. I mean, well,
AB 32 is 2006.
That's a big deal.
Yeah.
Cap and trade programs for California.
Yeah. They always talk about how that's like everybody in the world looking at this too, because it's such a new concept, and everybody's seeing how it goes based on what we do and the success or failures of the program.
Well, let's doing good, and then it kind of.
We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. California relief. I don't know. Kiss some butt at the same time.
Find out Chuck Mills' birthday. Put that on there.
No, this guy, what is his name? Leo Buc.
Oh, yeah.
The invention of common vision.
Leo Buc is born. What's that? For what? Paris was last year. Yeah. Wasn't it?
All right. We're ready. Yeah. So while we get ready to share, I'm going to get in trouble if I go in front of those speakers, huh? While we get ready to share, since you're taking on tough subjects, here's a plate full of candy to pass around. Take a deep breath, eat a piece of chocolate. We'll keep going. So we've got the microphone in the back. I'd love to hear a little bit about your timeline of the environmental movement.
All right, we'll be the first ones. So we slimmed it down because we could have gone all the way back to, if we were thinking about North America, we got all the way back to Native Americans and how they influence the environment. But we push it forward to the modern environmental movement. And one of the first federal level things that we saw in the modern environmental movement, we just started at the formation of the Forest Services in 1905. And progressively from that, we moved towards a huge thing for the United States on a global scale was the national parks in 1916. And then more on the kind of personal level and the outreach level of education, Rachel Carson, 1957. Moving forward on kind of the political acts, we got into the Nixon era with the Clean Water Act, and then progressively through the cultural kind of identity movement of the grassroots activism of the 1970s. And from there, it became a more mainstream level within the acknowledgement of climate change with the Kyoto Protocol. And then within that, we also had some huge things that really impacted, I think, a lot of us in upbringing was, the ozone, hole in the ozone, chlorofluorocarbons, and then getting closer to where we are today, AB 32. Unsure where that'll go, but it was monumentous. And then most recently, talking about the Paris Summit, large scale.
I see a microphone move over there. Yeah. Let's get another one.
All right, so we did a little different twist on it. So we started talking about indigenous resistance to colonization, and we kind of talked about environmental justice, so inspired by that. And then land cultivation by African slaves. Somewhere in between that, we have the Homestead Act. And then we have the conservation movement. In the midst of that, we have Dust Bowl, labor and tenant rights, and farm workers organizers. And then we also have white flight and suburbanization. And after that, we have Rachel Carlson's piece. And the Creation Earth Day, Clean Water and Air Act, anti-nuclear movement, and climate justice movement that brings us to today.
Awesome.
It's totally different.
Yeah. And let's get one more group to share. I want to hear from one more group. You all interested? Will you be our one more group over there?
You know, I think the only thing that maybe wasn't spoken about was the alternative energy, such as solar. So
Okay.
that would be where we are at today.
Gotcha. Awesome.
Similar.
Awesome. So the reason I asked everyone to do that exercise is not just because, oh, it happened again, is not just because, you know, knowing your history generally is important, but because specific to the environmental movement, the history that we think of when we think of the history of the environmental movement tends to be more the one that the first group gave us, right? It tends to sort of start around the Forest Service and start around the National Park Service and go up through you know, the conservation movement, and then move to some of the grassroots organizing, and then some of the sort of market-based solutions that people are working on now, like, you know, certification processes, you know, sort of the solutions through voting through your dollar stuff. And we very rarely land on the environmental justice side. I mean, I was very, very excited to hear a lot of that come out of that group. But there's, you know, whole substantial parts of the environmental timeline that get left out of that. For how many of you does Washington v. Davis or Alexander v. Sandoval mean anything? Okay. So for a long time, under Title VI of the Federal Civil Rights Act, you were able to sue the federal government or sue individual entities based on disparate impacts, right, for people of color. So from the time the Civil Rights Act was passed till 1976 with Washington v. Davis, disparate impact was actually enough, right? And this was a big tool in the tool belt for environmental justice work before environmental justice was a word, right, was a term. You could sue for disparate impact. And in 76, the Supreme Court decided that you had to prove racialized intent, right, with this Washington versus Davis case. This is a big deal, right? All of a sudden, an impact isn't good enough. You have to prove that inside the individual or the group of people's heads who wrote the piece of legislation was a maniacal plan to disadvantage people of color. It doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense if what we're looking for is a more equitable society. In fact, I would argue that ruling, what they were looking for, may have been a less equitable society. You skip all the way to Alexander v. Sandoval in 2001, right? And the Supreme Court in this case holds that it has to be a right that is specifically outlined in Title VI of the Constitution, and holds that individuals lose the ability for private action, right? So in 2001, we lose the ability for private action. And what that means is that you can no longer sue the government or individual entities as an individual over a violation of the Civil Rights Act, right? When it comes to environmental justice, when it comes to housing justice, when it comes to all these different things. So we lose another tool in the tool belt at that point. Another thing that came up in that group, which I was so excited to hear, you all referenced the UFW, right? I heard farm worker organization in there. The United farm workers organizing on the West Coast, have had some of the biggest victories in the environmental movement of anyone. When we look at legislative victories, the banning of methyl bromide, for example, the UFW fought hard for the banning of methyl bromide. The farm workers' rights movement and the environmental movement are perfectly paired with each other. This is one of the places where there's so much opportunity for us as an environmental movement to do solidarity work and justice and to build a more meaningful coalition. That's exactly what happened with methyl bromide. The UFW and the Sierra Club came together to work on that campaign, and we saw results. Methyl bromide has been banned in California for over 5 years now. The Environmental Leadership Summit that I referenced in 1991, it's another huge part of what shaped the environmental movement today. It's where the term environmental justice came from. It's where the principles of environmental justice came from. The 1982 Warren County hazmat case, right, which was a case where they wanted to put a hazmat dump site in a community of color, which has happened all too often. It was one of the first well-documented legal battles about that was won. These have been tremendous, tremendous moments in shaping the environmental movement and what it is today. And very, very often, the concepts and the tactics that we use have actually been defined by communities of color and have been invented by communities of color. And yet we persist in saying that this is a white movement. So we're going to talk about why on earth that has maintained, right, as a mythology. And to my mind, the way that has maintained, the primary cause of lack of representation in much of the environmental movement is the unwillingness of white people in the movement to investigate and correct issues of race and power within ourselves, our organizations, and society as a whole. I'd like to attribute that quote to myself, because that's who wrote it, but it seemed tacky to do in the slide, so I'll do it verbally. So, what do I mean when I say this, right? There's an incredibly typical script, and we've seen this play out dozens of times. This is played out with common vision. I'll be the first to admit that 13 years ago, I watched this script play out almost perfectly, right? So something will come up within an organization or a coalition, an accusation of racism is leveled at an individual. This is usually from a person of color to a white person, and it's taken as a charge of deliberate foul play and met with defensiveness. Who else seen that? Right? So someone says, hey, that thing you did, that thing you said, or that thing your organization is doing is racist. Right? Here's what happens. The people being accused, they defend themselves, right? They say, no, that wasn't racist. Here's 15 reasons why that wasn't racist. Among them are, I have black friends, I didn't mean it to be racist, so on and so forth, right? As a side note, I'm going to give you a hint here, white folks. If a person of color tells you that something might be racist, if you disagree with a person of color about whether an issue of race, you're probably wrong. You are most likely wrong, right? The reason is we're intentionally blinded from birth as to how race patterns in society, right? As to how race determines your outcomes in society. We are intentionally blinded. We're told we live in a meritocracy, so on and so forth. Right? I like to say that white people who are starting to think about race and how it functions in society are, we're in kindergarten, 3rd grade. People of color tend to have a PhD in how race and racism functions in society. So you are almost definitely wrong if you're in a heated argument with a person of color trying to tell them about how something wasn't racist. So it's usually met with defensiveness, right? And generally, a character resume, right? Generally, the defense for it has nothing to do with the thing, has nothing to do with the outcome of the thing. It has to do with what the person meant, what the person's background is, the liberal arts college that they went to, where they were part of the diversity council, so on and so forth. The defense is very rarely about the impact side of something, right? But what's under question, what's being questioned when an action is, accused of being racist, is the impact of it. That's what's being questioned, is whether it has a racially disparate impact, whether it has a negative impact on people of color. Oh, I love this one. It's so heady, but it's so important. Being fair-minded is a really important piece of probably everyone in here's identity, right? I'm guessing. It's certainly an important piece of my identity, right? Thinking that I'm fair-minded, thinking that, I don't carry a bunch of prejudices around. Turns out you do. Unconscious bias studies confirm that over and over. But rather than exploring the merit of the accusation, of the iniquity in the person, in the item that's coming up, a character resume gets put out there, right? And a counter-accusation comes along, you explain your true motives, so on and so forth. And while the initial thing that got brought up, the initial accusation of racism may not have been being taken personally, may not have even been a huge deal. This silencing, this unwillingness to investigate the impact side, this unwillingness to find out that person's perspective, learn from that person, right, and correct whatever bit of injustice is being done in that moment, that does get taken personally. And that blows up coalitions, that blows up organizations, that has people leave staffing positions. How many folks have run that script? Accusation of racism, met with defense, and it just goes nowhere because the impact side doesn't get investigated. I know it's more of you than that. So when we talk about how we're going to create a more diverse urban forestry movement, it starts with anti-racist culture, right? It starts with a culture within the movement, a culture within our own organizations, and a personal ethos that the work we do is going to deconstruct racism, right? The work we do is going to make a more equitable society. Everyone buy into that? Can I get a verbal yes on that? No, oh, that's a great question. All right, so I just got the color blindness question. Is it the same as being race blind? It absolutely is not the same thing as being race blind. It is the opposite of being race blind in some ways. We have had 400 years in this country of affirmative action for white people. Hundreds of years of affirmative action for white people. You don't undo that. Oh man, we're going to skip ahead to the ending quote because it's so good and so relevant. Lyndon B. Johnson, of all people. This is the next and more profound stage of the battle for civil rights. We seek not freedom, but opportunity. Not just legal equity, but human ability. Not equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and as a result. Right? That's what we're looking for. We're looking for equity in society. And you don't get there, the beginning part of this quote, which is a little too graphic, is about how you cannot get there just by saying, all right, everyone's fair game, good luck out there, 400 years of affirmative action for white people, billions of dollars, trillions of dollars of accrued intergenerational wealth, educational resources, but now it's fair. Now it's a level playing field, and we're all going to do well, right? You don't get there with color blindness. When you lay color blindness over a society that is inequitable by design, you end up with more inequity. Backing back up. So when we talk about building a more diverse movement, more diverse organizations, we have to look at how our organizations can dismantle racism actively. And I want to applaud, again, I want to applaud Relief. Like, you're doing it. It's fantastic. The equity and inclusion piece from last year's conference is, from what I can tell, already paying dividends in the diversity in the room. Like, from what I can tell in conference calls, in Relief's memberships, like, there is already growing diversity within this urban forestry community. And I applaud that, and we have more work to do. How many of your organizations have organizational statements, anti-discrimination statements? Are they in hiring and volunteering? How many of you have them in hiring and volunteering? How many of your organizations have them for the way you interact with the communities that you serve? Huh. That seems like a place where we should have statements on this, right? How we interact with the communities that we serve. It is a tricky part. Absolutely.
For those statements, it's really important that the statements aren't just a tagline at the end of your application form or at the end or on a particular part on your website, but actually including them in the descriptions that you have within your organization, because people of color will look for those sorts of things in your organization. If a person of color goes to your website and sees a little tagline at the bottom of a page that says, we're equal opportunity to all people of race, gender, ability, whatever, that's not as inspiring as if it's in a mission statement or if it's throughout the materials on your website or in your materials for your organization.
How many folks here consider themselves and their organizations working in environmental justice? Sure. How many folks have justice as a component of their mission statement? It's worth considering because when we talk about, and this is the thing that got me on doing this presentation, is last year there was a few presenters, and one of them said something almost offhandedly, right? They were talking about raising volunteer participation in communities of color. And they said very quickly, very offhandedly, and once you join people in their social and political, around their social and political priorities and work in solidarity, you'll have absolutely no problem getting people to volunteer to plant trees with you. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's the whole thing right there. They just said it. And I chatted with some people afterwards and went, oh man, that thing about that was awesome. And people went, did he say that? It's huge. Justice work and creating a diverse community within urban forestry are the same thing. If we're not doing justice work, our natural allies in communities of color are looking for the justice component of our work. And if it's not there, if it's not out front, if we're not openly trying to create justice in the world, then we're going to have a hard time building that diversity within the movement. That's just how that is. And these organizational statements, they're a start for that. Putting them front and center is a start for that. You have to know the history of the area where you're working, right? You have to understand the history of systemic racism nationally and how it affects your stakeholders, right? If you have not gone back and done your reading, right, if you've not learned about how systemic racism affects your stakeholders, it is nearly impossible for you to do assessment of the services that your stakeholders need. Furthermore, if you don't understand this stuff, in my experience, and I've been told this over and over, that white people who don't demonstrate an understanding of this are viewed as ticking time bombs in communities of color. If you don't do this work to understand how systemic racism works, right, it is only a matter of time before you're going to hurt somebody with your words and actions in a community of color. That's just it. And continuing examination of where your work intersects with the legacy of racism in America. The intersection of urban forestry and redlining, as we discussed earlier, is tremendous, right? It's a tremendous intersection. We have to understand where our work intersects with this stuff in order to understand how we can do that deconstruction work. Some choice words on humanism. I know a lot of the times we want to fall into this people are just people, right? People all need the same things. Everybody needs canopy, right? Everybody needs a relationship with the urban forest. That's true. One of the risks in this is we can fall into people are just like me, right? Rather than thinking people are people, we start thinking people are just like me and people need what I need. We have to understand that the experience of being a white person in this country is very different than being a person of color, and specifically each community of color has unique considerations and unique experience to themselves. You have to begin to understand that. And within that, people are all individuals. Those are both true statements. And you have to be able to look at the world through both those lenses simultaneously. Otherwise, if you're picking one over the other, again, ticking time bomb. All right, so we talk about building ally culture. How many of you have heard that word ally before? That's a hot buzzword. I promised myself I would do this entire presentation today without using the word privilege, and I think I did it. So when we talk about building ally culture, organizationally, we have to do trainings for leadership, staff, and volunteers. Our organization, Common Vision, before any volunteer works with schools, they receive about 6 hours of anti-racism training, which I know it sounds like a lot. I'm being self-congratulatory. Yay, we do 6 hours of anti-racism training. Up until a few years ago, when white people really started thinking about systemic racism and critical race theory, they had, our average volunteer age is 23 years old, so they had 23 years of hidden racism training. So we were trying to undo it in 6 hours. We do what we can, but these trainings are absolutely critical. To give you a little bit of a perspective from our place, from 2004 to 2006, we had 0 people of color volunteer in our programs. 0. From 2007 to 2010, we had 3 people of color volunteer in our programs. Our last 3 tours, 2008, we started taking anti-racism work seriously. 2011, we started taking it more seriously. We doubled our trainings on it. 2012, we put our organizational statements front and center. In 2015 and 16, 40% of our volunteers were people of color. So, I mean, it's great. Like, it's wonderful that our organization has made these strides, and I'm really, really proud of the strides that our organization has made. Our goal is that our volunteer crews are representative of the communities that we serve, representative of California as a whole. That's our goal. And our work in diversity isn't done until we get there. Like, period, for Common Vision, that's the case. Again and again, these guidelines, right? The guidelines that we put forward, the statements that our organization puts forward, making sure that our staff, our leadership, and our volunteers, our leadership go through biannual trainings, right? Our board of directors, we take our sponsors through diversity training. We had a sponsor who wanted to sponsor an initiative for an entire school district, and they said, hey, we want to do employee engagement activities in that. We want to work with the schools with you. And we said, great, you just got to take these anti-racism trainings because your staff is predominantly white and you want to work in a community that's predominantly people of color, so you need to know how to work as an ally. And that's a risk, right? And you have to be willing to take those risks. This next bullet point is tremendously important. Do not rely on people of color within the organization to create a culture of diversity. We often do this within organizations. We often have a few people of color and we're like, oh, they're going to handle the race and racism issues, right? They'll be the experts on that. Not their job. They've got enough stuff to deal with being a person of color in this world. The people who it's incumbent upon to do the deconstruction work of racism are the people who have benefited from it, right? For people to put on their staff of color that they're going to be the racism experts, there's a tendency when people go to these trainings, you can watch it if you don't tell people not to do it, for people to like flock to the people of color in the room afterwards and be like, tell me, teach me. Not their job. It's incumbent upon us to learn about it. If it's offered, accept graciously. You're very lucky. If you're offered some education from a person of color within your organization, listen, accept it graciously, but it is not their job unless it is explicitly their job. Break silence. Every time there's a microaggression in your office, every time there's something little, and there's a lot of leadership in this room. I know we got a lot of EDs and program directors and all that. It's your job to interrupt it. Every single time, it's your job to stand up for your staff of color, your volunteers of color, your participants of color. It is your job. Continue the conversation. Have these conversations with your whole staff. Languaging on issues of race and power are really, really important. If we don't build common languaging, if we don't build the skill of discussing it, we can't possibly do the work that's needed. And finally, recruit for paid positions. And I know what some of you are thinking. And what some of you are thinking right now is, what is it? It's not NIMBY, it's NIMS, not in my sector, right? I can't find people of color who are qualified for jobs in my sector. Guess what? Every sector says that, right? Every sector says, they're just not here in my sector. They must be somewhere else. Recruit and hire for paid positions. I know what you're thinking now. Maybe I can't find qualified people. They're qualified. There are qualified people. Unconscious bias very often will lead you to think people are not qualified. There are people of color applying for jobs who are qualified with environmental organizations. I know at least 10 right now who are out looking for jobs in environmental organizations and cannot get them despite being clearly qualified for them. So I don't know if it's you, but people need to start hiring for these positions, and people need to deal with a little bit of the unconscious bias that's leading to folks not getting hired. There's that Lyndon B. Johnson quote, which means I'm out of talking points. This quote, I really can't read this quote enough times. This quote was from his speech at the rollout, at the signing of the Affirmative Action Bill. And this is the piece of civil rights that we have not yet accomplished. The theory part, the theory, we're all equal, got dealt with a while ago, supposedly. But this equity piece, where what we're looking for is a society where skin color is not a deterministic factor on what your outcomes in life are, what your access to education is, what your criminal justice outcomes may be, what your health outcomes may be, what your wealth outcomes may be, so on and so forth. That's the piece we're working on now. And I sincerely hope that the urban forestry community continues to take that piece seriously and do work towards that end. I think we have time for some questions, which is when things can get really hairy. Mm-hmm. Mm.
Thanks. I was glad that you mentioned the climate justice movement. I'm pretty new to urban forestry, but my background is working on campaigning and organizing around climate justice issues, and I feel like one thing that we've seen in that movement in the last 10 years, 15 years is kind of, well, the carving out of that actual term. Pointing to the strong intersectionality between capitalism, racial oppression, social segregation, so many, gender depression, how that's all wrapped up within the climate movement. And so I'm interested in hearing thoughts from the urban forestry community about how we can continue to kind of craft the message of intersectionality within this particular movement as well, because it's very clear, as for all the reasons we talked about, that this is a huge issue. It's incredibly important. It's the future of where a lot of this work needs to go, or that it's already going in that direction, but how do we kind of elevate that message?
I like that question.
Okay.
I mean, to my mind, and the question is about how we use urban forestry, I think, as an amplifier for climate education. In our work, we work with schools throughout the state, and we teach every single kid we work with about anthropogenic climate change. Every single kid we work with gets the opportunity to talk about climate change, learn about how it works. And I would encourage everyone in this room, anytime we're doing an education piece with planting a tree, we have the coolest opportunity in the world when it comes to climate change education, because everyone else who's doing climate change education has to present it as and it's a catastrophic threat, right? But they don't have one thing that we have going for us when we're doing climate education, which is we're planting a tree, right? We're actually taking a community scale action where students, in our case, or volunteers or participants can actually feel like they're having an impact, albeit a, infinitesimal, though significant somehow at the same time, impact on climate change. So we have this really cool opportunity to bring climate change into every educational interaction that we have, and that in and of itself, to some extent, educating the next generation. They're still not teaching climate change in California schools as part of core curriculum.
I should clarify one thing, though, if I may.
Yeah.
I agree with everything you just said. I don't think I did a good enough job of articulating this. What I'm suggesting is that urban forestry as a field and as a discipline and as a practice can kind of give itself a facelift, or kind of reconstruct itself in a similar way, in comparison to the way that climate change kind of elevated those issues of justice. How do we use urban forestry to do that? Does
Gotcha.
that make sense? Sorry.
Yeah,
That's what I
absolutely.
meant. Okay.
Absolutely. I think that I think again, there's still a real big opportunity there. First of all, you have to actually start doing the justice work component around it, right? That is, you can't sort of rebrand, right, and give yourself a facelift to doing justice work through urban forestry unless you're taking that angle seriously. And I think in the last, 2-year cycle, the urban forestry community has either willingly or non-willingly been dragged into justice work. A lot of folks were doing justice work in this room well before that, but I think it is sort of headed that way regardless. We're about to enter, sort of a time in American history soon, and this is going to be so great, where we're a plurality. Everyone know that word? Plurality? Hey, I'll give you a little side tip for free. When people say majority, minority country, what a weird term. It's actually a plurality, right? Where you have no majority of people. Majority, minority country is like some weird, confusing term made up to maintain a white status quo. It's called a plurality, right? And if we're going to have meaningful movements of any kind as we enter a plurality in this country, they're going to be coalitions built across racial lines. So that facelift is eventually going to be a sink or swim situation. I mean, if you're not building justice-based work, if you're not building multiracial coalitions, as the demography in this country changes, you're going to go the way of the dodo.
Leo, actually, you gave given a lot of hints, but I still would ask you to elaborate on this partnership, interacting with the communities, and let's say there is a lot of kind of underwater things. Let's say you come, plant trees, and okay, they kind of, you're patronizing them or using them, and let's say in Orange County, underprivileged, underserved are mostly Latina communities like Santana, and so, and let's say how, like, the psychological situation when you come to them, and especially your grants are for that, for kind of, and they may be aware of that, so it's kind of difficult interaction. So if you can kind of make more hints and
absolutely.
Advice on that.
I've been thrilled to see more of the money from this granting cycle ending up with local organizations. I know that sounds weird coming from a guy who runs an organization based out of Ukiah, California, that works all over the state, but it has been thrilling to watch more money go directly into the communities where the work is happening in the last couple of granting cycles. I want to speak to one thing in that, which is that a lot of times people look at this list, this bullet point of stuff we're talking about to build ally culture, and the first one is these trainings, right? And people will leave these trainings where they're starting to understand sort of systemic racism and so on and so forth, with this big, like, I just got all this information, I have no idea what to do with it, right? And a lot of the times, what happens in here is that it's a total attitudinal shift, right? When you start seeing the way race functions in society, right, and the way it determines people's outcomes, you end up with a pretty solid attitudinal shift. And you hear very, very often from white folks who receive these trainings sort of like, yeah, but that's not like a noticeable thing, like that's not like something that I'm actually using, and it is. It is. It changes the whole way that you approach interactions. It changes the whole way, brings a whole new level of respect, and the feedback that we get over and over from people of color and communities of color that we work with is that those attitudinal shifts that you may think are subtle are not subtle at all. They're actually a tremendous difference in the way interaction gets approached.
What's the way to make them accept you? It's not like just my attitude. Of course, it's important, but
yeah.
They feel my attitude, if I'm sincere or not, and this social, environmental justice, I guess that's, but for them to believe.
Yeah. You can't make someone accept you, first of all. This is funny. I'm going to refer back to the quote from last year that got us going down this path for the conversation this year. And that is, you may have a hard time getting volunteers for your tree planting initiative, but once you join people in solidarity with their social and political needs for like a decent life and a decent survival in this country, you are much more likely to get that support going forward. Yeah.
I have so much to say on this issue. I invite more conversation on this issue, especially as we talk about entering these communities and how we do that respectfully. But I just want to provide one example, because some of the tension for me is as I hear these things that are, you know, just heavy. And I think about the fact that a lot of us can't change, let's say, our program offerings, the way that we are a tree planting organization. How do we continue to be a tree planting organization while incorporating these really heavy things? An example of a time that this has worked, where we've continued to be able to offer our programming, was partnering with an environmental justice group in a certain neighborhood that had an office in that neighborhood, and we'd already learned some things about entering into these community spaces. But they were working on the legislative side, which on the policy change side for air quality and recycling pollution, all those, you know, those environmental burdens on that community, and they were training their environmental leaders in the community to do that work, and we were able to provide that tangible experience of putting a tree in the ground to help air quality. While they're working on the long-term impacts, we were able to come in and work with them on becoming, you know, our model of citizen forestry, where the community is leading the planting, picking locations, picking trees, organizing the event, recruiting volunteers, doing all those things with our support. We were supporting this air quality issue that was really important to that group, but in a tangible way. But that's the challenge, is addressing these issues while still maintaining, these are the kinds of services we see the needs for. You know, we see the needs for dealing with the policy issues with regards to the Willett settlement here in Los Angeles, or providing tree planting and care, but also including those elements in these communities. But I definitely think we have so much more to talk about when it comes to approaching these groups and joining with them and sitting with them in community like you're discussing.
Yes. I'm not sure there was a question there. Yes. Yeah, no, I'm absolutely with you. I do want to offer that, like, as Rachel says, like, the discussion is the starting point, right? And looking at how I think everyone in here can maintain your core identity as an organization while still doing justice work. I think that's a feasible goal for everybody in here. I would argue there's very, very often, and I'm not sure if I heard this in there or not, I'm not sure I did, there's very often sort of an idea, and you see this in the last 8 years in politics very, very prevalently, of, you know, people realizing that for racial justice to occur, white people are going to have to lose something. And that likely may be the case. If so, it was something unearned in the first place. But it's also possible that what we're going to bring in is a huge array of talent and skill and genius that has been underrepresented because it has been underserved for centuries. And there's a real good possibility in my mind that as an urban forestry coalition, that as an environmental movement, that as a society as a whole, as a humanity as a whole, that the pie just gets bigger, right? Maybe I found an area where, no, I'm not going to quote Reagan, lifting tide rises all boats. Is that Reagan? Ugh. But there's a real possibility that as we do this justice work, that we just build a bigger pie, because there's so much more talent out there. There's so much more skill out there. There's so much more opportunity out there that's being underinvested in. Yes?
Native Americans. You barely mentioned them, but what about their kind of piece in all this environmental justice and tree planting? And how are they involved at all? And they are the original stewards of this land.
Yeah,
a lot of them are still in California.
And I appreciate you bringing that up. There's a tremendous amount to discuss with regards to Native Americans and urban forestry and Native Americans and environmental justice. It's not an area that I have a tremendous amount of experience in. Our work is primarily either with low-income urban schools or low-income schools in agricultural areas. And in both of those capacities, I don't have a lot of experience interacting with Native communities, nor do I know a lot about the specific needs of Native communities. I wouldn't feel good offering unsubstantiated opinions. Yeah, but I would encourage, me for one, and everybody else here to investigate that further. Yeah. If no one else has any questions, I'll just walk away. We got 8 minutes left, though. I got to make good on it now.